Hi everyone, my name is Leanne and today I am bringing you my June reading wrap up. So me taking you through all of the books that I read in June and giving you little mini reviews of them. I read I think 13 books this month, so I have quite a few to get through. But before we jump into the books, I do want to just give a couple of life updates. The more eagle-eyed amongst you may notice that I am in a different place. The setup behind me is basically the same. My bookshelves are the same. My books are arranged in more or less the same way. But I am in a new house. And that is because I very recently moved to London to start my first job in publishing. I am joining the amazing sales and marketing teams at Pan Macmillan, and I am still pinching myself about that. I am so excited. And I would like to do a full video on the latter parts of doing my master's in publishing and how I think that's helped me get a job in publishing and how I went about getting this job and all that kind of stuff once I've actually processed it in my own brain. Now, I knew I would be so busy across this move. I'm, getting ready to start the new job, moving into the new house. I'm also still working on my final project for my master's. So I do have a couple of videos that I pre-filmed when I was still at my old house, which will be going up in the next couple of weeks. But anyways, I feel like that's the housekeeping out of the way and I can now get into the books because I do have a lot to talk about. I'm gonna start with the fiction books, and I actually went on a bit of a non-fiction binge this month, so there aren't that many fiction books to actually talk about. But the first one is Queenie by Candice Carty-Williams. I can tell you now that this book will definitely be making an appearance in my favourite books of the year so far video. I'm obsessed with this book. This book is like, imagine if Bridget Jones' Diary was told from the perspective of someone from Jamaica who lives in Brixton. Like it's kind of like that. Queenie is in, I think, like her mid-20s, and it deals with what happens in her life after she goes through a really difficult breakup. It deals with her relationship with herself and her body and how she kind of uses sex as an unhealthy coping mechanism in the wake of the breakup. It also looks at her relationship with her family and her friends, her career and how she's somewhat uncertain in how she's navigating that. It also deals a lot with her mental and physical health as well, and I thought representations of what Queenie experiences in both of those regards were really important, and she told them from a perspective that I thought I'd never really read from before. There was a particular part of her both physical and mental health that I found particularly touching, and I think it's a topic that as a society we don't talk about enough, and I definitely don't see depicted enough in literature as well. It's a really compelling, touching read. All of the characters felt really believable to me. You just find yourself, while being frustrated with Queenie at moments, you are really rooting for her. When I was reading this book, I felt quite similarly to how I felt when I was reading Normal People by Sally Rooney, which was my favourite book that I read in 2018. Not because of the subject matters or anything, although they both had that similarity of like navigating romantic relationships and the understanding of the self and that kind of thing. But the experience I had with reading both of those books was that I really wanted to ration reading them. Like, I knew I could have flown through them in a couple of sittings, but I didn't want to because I just didn't want the book to end. And that's a really rare experience for me. So I love this book. I can't recommend it highly enough. The next book I'm going to talk to you guys about is Tinman by Sarah Winman. This was the second Sarah Winman book that I've read this year, and I definitely found some sort of similarities in how this book was written to how When God Was a Rabbit was written, in that Sarah Winman really trusts her readers to be able to connect the dots, and that was something that I really appreciated with this book. This book tells the story of very complex and sincere relationships between three characters. So we have Ellis and Michael, who had a very close bond when they were younger, and how that relationship is altered or impacted by a character named Annie. And one of the things that I really loved about this book was its representation of bisexuality. I just feel really honest and sincere, and again, that's what I keep harping back to when I talk about this book, is how sincere it feels. There is a portion of this novel that is set in France, and that's not something that I normally enjoy. Not things being set in France, but when like characters like go off on holiday or they go somewhere else, I normally find that really takes me out of the story and the setting. But I didn't find that with this book at all. It's really powerful, and like When God Was a Rabbit, Sarah Winman has this ability to convey so much emotion in just one sentence, because she will give you enough for you to be able to work out what's going on and just let that emotional impact sit with you. It's beautiful. That's the only way I can describe it. It's beautiful what she does. When I was reading this, I thought this was her second novel, but I believe she does have a novel that came between When God Was a Rabbit and this one. So I'd be really intrigued to pick that one up because she's an author that I've been really, really enjoying. The next fiction book I have to talk to you guys about is Tess of the Durbervilles by Thomas Hardy, and this was my classic pick for the month. Okay, how do I start to describe my feelings about this book? Okay, what happens in this book is that there's a young, like, country girl named Tess. Tess is a character that has a really strong sense of right and wrong, and what is the proper thing for her to do, the most just thing for her to do. An unfortunate set of circumstances lead her to spending some time with a man named Alec, and while she is sleeping, Alec rapes her. This is an event that spirals Tess's life, and it impacts every aspect of her life. And when she begins to form a new relationship with a man named Angel Clare, she is repeatedly declining his advances because she sees herself as like tainted and part of a scandal, because that's how people who were victim of things like rape were seen in this period of time. Like, the blame would always be put on the victim and not the perpetrator. And I think how the narrator of this book handled that was really interesting, because the narrator presents it as like it's in no way Tess's fault, and I thought that was a really strong and powerful perspective of being like, no, this is in no way the woman's fault at all. But at the same time, this book places a huge amount of emphasis on like fate and things being predetermined. So there is this sense of like Tess had to be raped, and I don't think that's like, I think it was very subversive for its time, obviously, but there was something about that didn't quite sit right for me, but obviously, as I said, you have to take it for of its time. There were a number of things that I really liked about this book. I really enjoyed Tess as a character. I found myself really rooting for her, which, like I said with Queenie, that's something that I really appreciate when it comes to fiction, you know, being able to root for someone. I really enjoyed the structure of this book, and it's split into basically like 7 phases. And in many ways, it feels like each of these phases could be a short story in and of itself. Like, it has its own, while it contributes to the overall overarching plot, it feels like each of these phases has a distinct plot of its own, which I really, really enjoyed as a structure. I also really enjoyed being able to see elements in this book that I had seen in the previous book I'd read by Thomas Hardy, which was Two on a Tower, which has a lot to do with like the stars and things like that, and that was in this book as well. There were a few things in this book that I found a little bit contrived and convenient, and some aspects were a little bit unbelievable, and I know that is a quite common criticism of this book, is that there are a lot of just convenient coincidences. And when it comes to things being unbelievable, I'm thinking about the coffin scene in particular. But I realise aspects like that, and also the kind of mansion, like the gothic ghostly mansion, were things that would have either attracted or appeased a gothic readership at the time. There's a lot to unpack with this book, and as I normally feel with my classic read of the month, I didn't necessarily love it, but I'm definitely glad that I read it. The final fiction book that I have to talk to you guys about is Julian is a Mermaid by Jessica Love, and this is a children's picture book that I have just fallen in love with. This book begins with Julian and their grandmother, or as they call her, their abuela, on public transport. And they spot these individuals who are dressed so glamorously and beautifully. And Julian becomes fascinated with how these people look. When they go home and Julian's abuela is in the shower, they begin to dress up like the people that they saw on the bus. So Julian is covering themselves in like a really elaborate headdress and dresses. And the book is basically about Julian exploring that side of themselves and how their abuela reacts to that in a really, really positive way. I thought this picture book was fantastic, both in terms of the story and the art style. Obviously, the subject matter of this book lends itself to a stunning color palette and design. I thought it was a really powerful story, and I thought it was a really important book in terms of diversity and depicting marginalized experiences in a way that is really accessible for children. Now onto the poetry. I read The New Testaments by Jericho Brown. This is a really powerful collection of poetry that explores race and sexuality in contemporary America. There's a huge focus on like the Black gay experience, and there's also depictions of violence in this book, and it is handled with a real lyricism, which I really appreciated. Poet subverts Bible verses in this collection, which I thought was something that was done really, really well and really cleverly. The style of poetry in this collection isn't necessarily what I'm drawn to. I tend to be drawn to kind of more like rhyme heavy kind of slam poetry kind of style. But nonetheless, I would really recommend this collection. I think it's really important and powerful. It manages to balance the personal perspective and the political perspective in a way that felt really genuine. Like being able to depict something as a wider, broader political and societal issue while still grounding it in their own experiences. I thought that was just done really, really well. Poet is dealing with so many complex topics in this book, and I think they managed to unpick them and do justice to them in a really, really sincere way. So yeah, that is one poetry book that I read and would recommend. The next poetry book that I read and would recommend is Nobody Told Me by Holly McNish. These style of poems are a lot more up my street. They're a lot more like funny and punchy and rhyme heavy. I've read a lot of Holly McNish before, and she is one of my absolute favourite poets, and I decided that it was about time that I got round to reading this book because I saw her perform at Derby Book Festival, and it meant so much to me to see her perform because her poetry has left such an impact on me as a writer. This book is a poetry collection, but it's also a collection of diary entries. In many ways, you could class it as a memoir, all about Holly being pregnant and becoming a mother. She explores how she feels about love, how she feels about her body, how she feels about sex, how she feels about consumerism when you become a parent. She deals with everything with so much honesty, and I think she says a lot of things that people think but don't necessarily always vocalize. And she talks about a lot of things that I had no idea were a thing when it came to like being a new parent. I really, really enjoyed this book. I learned a lot from it. I realized a lot from it, and I think it's one that I will definitely come back to at a later stage in my life when perhaps it's more applicable to my own life. Now I actually have 7 non-fiction books to talk to you guys about, so if non-fiction's not your jam, bye, thank you for watching, although I have so many fantastic non-fiction books to talk to you guys about, so I hope you will stick around. The first of those is Becoming by Michelle Obama. I avoided this book for a little while because I wanted the hype to die down, but it was incredible. It definitely lives up to the hype. This book follows Michelle Obama's life from her like childhood and early education through her early career and her relationship with Barack Obama, and him beginning to think about running for president, being president, and then his terms finishing. And it follows Michelle through all of that and her trying to understand her role in all of that. So her having an idea of what her life was going to look like, and then that being changed by what her husband decided to do, and how she forged her own legacy and career as part of a role that isn't really defined. It looks a lot at how they parented while being president and first lady and the various challenges that presented for them. I thought this was a really, really well written book. No topics felt like they were glossed over or rushed by. I think everything was given the adequate attention. What I thought was really interesting about this book was, obviously, she's talking about experiences that have been shown globally, and it's giving an insight to how what actually went on in the backgrounds of those events and how she was personally feeling in those events, which I thought was a really interesting insight. And overall, I would just highly recommend this book, whether you are coming at it from like being interested in like the feminist kind of style of things and that aspect of her life, whether you're coming at it from a political standpoint. That idea of seeing the true feelings and the background to events that you are already familiar with was something that I really enjoyed about another nonfiction book that I read in June, and that was Brutally Honest by Mel B. Mel B, Melanie Brown, Scary Spice, the girl from the Spice Girls. Her memoir was so powerful. If you are coming to this book for like gossip about the Spice Girls, that isn't what it is, although you do get obviously an insight into the life of the Spice Girls, but it is very much grounded in this memoir being about Mel B's very difficult and often abusive relationships with men. It explores the numerous bad relationships that she has been in and seeks some sort of clarity as to why she found herself in these situations, how she dealt with them, how she could have dealt with them better. And she's very honest about her own. She's very honest, but also very forgiving of herself for how she could have handled things differently. The terrible things she went through. Honestly, I was listening to this on audiobook, and there were moments where I just had to stop listening to it because it was too much. And it's not Mel B that narrates it. I will find the name of the narrator. The book is narrated by Zara Abrahams, and she did a fantastic job of reading this book. Mel B didn't want to read it, one, because she's dyslexic and she would have found it quite difficult, but also because of the really harrowing stories she's telling. She found it too emotional to read, and Zara did a phenomenal job of reading this book to the point where I like forgot it wasn't Mel B. Like, she was really able to capture her tone of voice and her wit, her phrasing. In this book, Mel is exploring various topics like fame, motherhood, friendship, her relationship with drugs and alcohol, exploring the experiences of a mixed race girl within the north of England, but also within the music industry. But it's all very much grounded in how it relates to those very difficult relationships. I also really appreciated how Mel talked very openly about her sexuality. So yeah, I would really recommend this book. Even though it's not full of like Spice Girls gossip, I think if you are someone who loves the Spice Girls like I do, you will really appreciate this book. Another nonfiction book that I read in June, and it was actually the first book I read in June, was Queer Intentions by Amelia Abraham. I went to book breaks, like Pride event launch for this book in Gaze the Word in London, and that was actually before I found out that I had an interview at Penn Macmillan. But I was really excited to go to that event, and Queer Intentions is just such a good book. I will leave the book break video linked down below in the description because I talk about it in that video alongside some other amazing LGBT plus YouTubers and Instagrammers. But essentially what this book is the author going around various parts of the world and talking to queer people about their different kinds of experiences in relation to pride, in relation to gender identity, in relation to how much they see their struggles as a political issue. It explores how people feel about marriage, and one of the most interesting chapters, I think, was the one that was about drag, and it looked a lot at the phenomenon of RuPaul's Drag Race and how that has done a great many like fantastic things for the LGBT plus movement, but in many ways it is also alienated members of the LGBT plus community, which is a perspective that I'd really considered before. Intersectional, it's really nuanced, and I think if you are someone who doesn't really know a lot about queer culture and wants to learn more, this book is fantastic for that. But equally, if you are someone who is a member of the LGBT plus community and feels quite well informed on things, like I did going into this book, I still found myself learning a lot from this. So I would recommend it no matter kind of how much you feel like you know about these kind of topics. One of the things I really loved about this book as well was how much it really felt like you were just sitting down with a friend. Like, by the end of this book, it feels like Amelia is your friend. It's probably my favourite non-fiction book of the year. I also read a really little book this month, and it is called No One Is Too Small to Make a Difference by Greta Thunberg. If you saw my video that I did with my friend Vic, where we spoke about how to make the book industry and the publishing industry more sustainable and eco-friendly, we spoke about this book in that video, and she let me borrow it afterwards, which was very kind of her. I will leave that video linked down below as well if you want to check it out. But this is essentially a collection of Greta Thunberg's speeches, so they're just like transcriptions. If you don't know, Greta Thunberg is the teenage girl who started the Youth Strike for Climate movement, which is essentially about young people in education taking Friday off to strike in protest for how governments are dealing or not dealing with the climate crisis. I thought her speeches were so eloquent and well put together and really thought-provoking. The one thing I will say about reading this book was that because she says a lot of the same things in her speeches, which, you know, would have happened at different times in different places, so it makes sense that she would be reasserting her best points. Because it is such a slim book, it does feel really rather repetitive when you're reading it, but nonetheless, I think what Greta Thunberg is doing is incredible, and I totally support her. In June, I also read Astrophysics for People in a Hurry by Neil deGrasse Tyson, and there is nothing like a book that is meant to break down astrophysics into its very simple terms to remind me that it's really good that I didn't go into science. I feel like I was at fault more so than the book was, because I didn't enjoy this book, but like I feel like it's my fault. I feel like I didn't focus on it enough. I feel like I didn't like try and retain it as much as I should have. I thought it would be like really valuable for me to read a book about a topic that I knew nothing about and like educate myself on it. But I don't think this kind of non-fiction book is the best way for me to do that. I think I would be better off learning about something like this through like a documentary. I found myself feeling a little bit like I was back at school again, even though Neil deGrasse Tyson breaks down everything in a way that is accessible. I just found myself not enjoying this book because I felt like I was in science lessons at school, whereas I think if I watched like a documentary on it, I wouldn't feel that way so much. Yeah, I feel like I don't adequately know how to tell you about this book, because I feel like my judgment of it is an unfair judgment, if that makes sense. The penultimate non-fiction book that I'm going to talk to you guys about is Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Rennie Edo-Lodge. And let me tell you, if you are like a white person who feels like really woke and feels like, yeah, I'm really informed on like race relations and like class prejudice and that kind of thing, I don't really need to read this book, you are exactly the person that needs to read this book. This book is really focused on like institutionalized, really ingrained racism that is like present in like really complex structures that are really difficult to break down. I think this book gives a really fascinating and important framework for understanding things like the inextricable links between race and class, whitewashed feminism, those kind of things that are really ingrained and difficult to unpick, but it's necessary that we do so. I learned so much from this book, and I think it is so important, and I really want to reread it because I listened to this on audiobook and it is read fantastically by the author herself, but I found that there were a lot of instances where I wanted to go back and reread something and give it more attention, or things that I wanted to underline, and obviously that's not that easy with an audiobook, so I think I would definitely like a physical copy of this book to reread and give it far more focus and attention than I was able to. And the final book I'm going to talk to you guys about is I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. This is the first of Maya Angelou's, I think it's 7 autobiographies. And I found this book really difficult to read because of the subject matters it deals with. This focuses on Maya Angelou's childhood, growing up in the American South, and how she was mistreated because of her race and because of her gender. It does feature the sexual grooming and assault of a minor, so be aware of that going into it. But if that's something that you feel able to read about, I think this is a really important read for understanding how that kind of experience can impact a person. It focuses a lot on discrimination and poverty, but what's really interesting about this is that it does feel like it's told through a childhood perspective. Like, this feels like a novel. Like, when I was reading it, I kept forgetting that this was someone's real life story because it does read like a novel. I'm definitely interested in reading the rest of her autobiographies. I have her third one, but I don't have the second one, which is called Gather Together in My Name. So I'm going to try track that one down in the same edition as this. But yeah, overall, a phenomenal book from a phenomenal woman. So there we have it. These are the books, plus quite a few audiobooks that I read in June. Do leave me a comment down below if you've read any of these books and would like to share your thoughts on them. If you are intrigued by any of them, there will be links to all of them down below in the description box. I'd love to hear any thoughts that you have down below in the comments, but that's all for me today. I hope you guys are doing well, and I will talk to you in my next video.